right, so reminder came to me this morning. I will share with you. The clock in the back is slow, so watch it as a guide, right? Right, so last week we kind of finished up what was the nominal class topic, right? The 9 commandments. And so we're off into sort of new territory this morning, but like the old sailors, we're not going to venture too far from shore, right? We're going to be a little conservative. We're going to be a little bit safe. We're going to talk about the other commandment, right? So we're essentially coming back to the topic that not exactly launched this class topic, but certainly the topic that launched the last time I taught Hebrews, talking about a lot of the nominally Christian churches that are doing a lot of Judaism, a lot of practices of Judaism. So here we are, we're going to talk about keeping the Sabbath today. So also slightly different. Today we're going to look at Deuteronomy 5 rather than Exodus, at least to start. So let's open up to Deuteronomy 5, 12 through 15. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So, in our pattern, what do we have here? We have a command for a weekly day of rest, right? And it's not just a rest given to like the Jewish father, right? It's very clear that this is for everybody, including Gentiles that are mixed in, even down to the animals, right? It declares that your donkey and so forth will have rest on the Sabbath. So we've talked about a lot, not all of the others, but a lot of the other commands that we've talked about were commands that had some sort of civil law application, right? They were about keeping order and harmony amongst the people. But this one doesn't particularly seem to have that, at least not to me. This is something different. So we need to ask, why? Why did God give this commandment? And of course, as always, the scripture gives us an answer, but unfortunately, we get sort of 2 slightly different answers. If we look in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, it says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day." So that was the justification for the rest that's given in Exodus. And then in Deuteronomy, in verse 15, it says, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." So which is it? Remember the Sabbath because God rested on the 7th day, or remember the Sabbath because you were slaves in Egypt? How can it be both?
It's all dedicated to God.
Okay, whoa, yeah.
The day was dedicated to God.
Okay. So I'm going to apologize for a third time, please.
It was the day for God. Everybody was to serve Him and remember Him no matter their circumstances.
Okay, so it's a day of remembrance, right, for God. But how is the justification about Egypt? That's the really strange one, right? It's kind of logical. God rested on the 7th day, so you also will rest on the 7th day. But this Egypt thing's a little bit weird, right? So when you see that in verse 15 of Deuteronomy, there's a linkage back to the first commandment, right? It says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, right? So it's a link. In Deuteronomy, there's this link back, right? It says it in Exodus, but he doesn't link back to it in the Sabbath day command. When you look at, and I did not make a strong effort, I'm just kind of going with generalities here, so please don't ask me for dates or years or whatever. But Exodus is written first, right? And Exodus records the events that have happened as they're leaving Egypt and immediately after they've exited slavery, right? So slavery just happened, right? Deuteronomy is written at a later date to the people who are 40 years on from slavery, right? So if you look in Deuteronomy 1 through 3, it's the setup of this book. It's telling you who this is for and when it is. It says, these are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness, in the Arabah opposite Suf, a bunch of towns. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the people of Israel according to all that the Lord had given him in commandment to them. Right? So we have sort of two different audiences for these communications, right? And I'm going to say Keith's correct. Somebody over here also said that both are possible, and we're going to come back to your comment. If you look in Exodus 20, in verse 12, it says, "Moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths as a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them." So it is a day to remember all of these things, right? And I think it's an important concept to walk away from, that not every verse in the Bible explains exactly everything about a topic. And just because this verse and that verse don't tell you the exact same thing about that topic, it doesn't make either verse wrong or the Bible contradict, right? What we're looking at here is the author of these books is talking to different people and reminding them of different things through the inspiration of the Spirit, of course, right? So God wanted those people who were 40 years away from slavery to remember that you would otherwise be Egyptian slaves if it wasn't for me, right? Remember that. And I'm going to step off a little bit and make a very strong point here that this is my opinion. It's just something that I observed. But in Genesis chapter 1:26, it says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over their livestock, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth," right? So man is set apart from everything else in creation, right? In Exodus, Israel is set apart as a nation. This is sort of the creation of the nation of Israel, that are a sanctified people, right? It says in Ezekiel 20:12, it says, "I'm the Lord who sanctifies them," right? I think I called that out as Exodus 20:12 earlier. I apologize. That's Ezekiel 20:12. So just interesting to me that in creation, man is set apart, set over all things, and then in Exodus you see God's people coming out and being defined as different than everything else, right? So Keith's saying basically that there's more than just because I said so here. There's a justification and an incentive, right? I've done these things for you. Now I'm telling you do these things back, right? All right, so let's look at Exodus 16, verse 23. He said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning." So they laid it aside till the morning as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none." On the seventh day, some of the people went out together, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the seventh day." So the people rested on the seventh day. So that's sort of the first action of a Sabbath, right? So we've seen it reported. This is so it's going to happen. Here we're talking about the first time that they really kind of did it, right? And it mentions that it didn't stink. There was a commandment that they weren't supposed to keep the manna overnight, and if they kept it overnight, it would get worms and maggots and things. So that's what that was about. Right. So any thoughts on the Old Testament Sabbath? How does that relate to us or anything of that nature? Okay, I brought a really short stack of notes today because I was hoping for participation. Dave's going to help you out, otherwise y'all going to sit.
I'm going to help you out, Jamie. Been there and done that. You look at how important the Sabbath was to God. I mean, it's brought up over and over, and when the
What's the penalty for not observing it?
Pardon?
What was the penalty for not observing it?
I'm blanking.
Death.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
pretty important.
But he stressed it the whole way through the Old Testament. Now Christ, his son, dies on the cross. He wants us to obey the first day of the week. It's just as important, maybe more important, because this is leading to our salvation. And I think everything that was done in the Old Testament leads up to what was going to happen in the New Testament.
Okay, so the Sabbath day becomes part of our salvation in as much as they had to take him off the cross because it was the Sabbath, right? And he's raised the day after the Sabbath, right? We're going to talk a little bit about that part, but yeah, the Sabbath is woven all through the Old Testament. Very important. Yes, ma'am.
I really like the verse you shared earlier, Ezekiel 20:12. There are 2 words in there that I think are important, maybe to your question. One is sign, right? Sabbath was a sign between God and the Israelites. The second is so that they may know that the Lord sanctifies. And so to your building on what Dave said, and with Christ is the one who sanctifies for us.
Right.
In the new covenant.
We're sanctified through Christ, right?
Right. And the sign of that covenant is what we do every first day of the week where we take the Lord's Supper. It's a sign of the covenant between Christ and us.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in just a second. Right. So, Joe.
The Old Testament's physical. The New Testament is spiritual. Getting back to exactly what was being said before there. And because we know we're sanctified through Jesus' death or his spirit from there. So we are doing what he said to the people back there, but in a different mode. So that's the real key, is the physical versus the spiritual.
I agree. Always try to be careful with that line of commentary, right? I understand what you're saying. People might be defensive if you say that there's not spirit or the whatever relationship with God wasn't important, that it was only the physical in the Old Testament, because we know that's not true. But at large, the law was manifested more in a physical way, right? It was more about works, and it was about the the prescribed form of worship, whereas after Christ, the new covenant, it's grace, and we worship in spirit and truth, and it's different, right? But we're not trying to say that the Old Testament didn't involve a spiritual worship. It should have, but frequently didn't, I think is that fair? Okay. Joe doesn't agree with me. Mm-hmm.
When you have all these commandments, there'll come a time when people ask, why are we doing these things? And in verse 20, he starts off a little bit. The writer says, when your sons ask you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us up out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders great and grievous against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household. And he brought us out from there that he might bring us in and give us the land he swore to give us to our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes to fear the Lord our God for our good always. And he gives some other reasons, that we might be righteous unto him. And so that's the reason why we do the commandments. Not necessarily because he commanded, but because it helps us take a part in his plan to fulfill, at least at this time, this nation, to preserve them alive.
Yeah, that verse reminds me very much of when they set the stones up on the other side of the river, right? And he said, when your kids ask, what's this pile of rocks, then you have this conversation, right? And of course, we have a similar situation in the Christian dispensation of the Lord's Supper, right? So where do we find this commandment in the New Testament? To keep the Sabbath. Trick question, right? We don't. So you have to ask, why not? Right? So we're going to go through some verses that are maybe not directly related to this specific topic, but at large, I think you'll see where we're headed. If you look in Romans 8, verses 1 through 4, it says, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death. For God has done what the law, weakened by flesh, could not do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So this one kind of touches on what Joe was talking about before, that we're moving into a spiritual relationship with God. And I think one of the key words in this is in verse 4, where it says that the law has been fulfilled. It says it's been fulfilled in us, but it's talking about Christ has met the standard of the law and fulfilled the requirements of the law, right? Let's look at Romans 10:4. It says, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So we have Christ. Christ has made his sacrifice, and so therefore that's the end of the law. In Galatians 3:10, for all who rely on works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. But the law is not faith, rather the one who does them shall live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. It is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree, so that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. So this particular act of remembrance or whatever is not repeated because it's part of an old system, right? And we're going to get a new way, right? So comments on the end of the law, was that, did I get it clear? Was that correct? Like, everybody track that? We're not under the old law anymore. Joe?
God himself commanded the seventh day. What did God do whenever Jesus came and lived on this earth? He turned that over, part of the religious to them, according to him on there. Christ told us to remember his death, burial, and resurrection, which was the sacrifice.
Okay.
There. So that's the two difference there. At the time, there's two, like I say, the first commandment we're told in Ephesians, it's gone. It's been fulfilled with that. And we've got the other ones. So now we've got another complete set of laws, which is Christ's commandments, and all that's from God, obviously, on there, to remember his death and resurrection. And the seventh day, remember God's work and he'd done up to that point.
So, Old Testament, remember God's activity, what God has done for us. New Testament, remember Christ, what Christ has done for us, and that was done on a different day, right? And we're going to talk about why it's a different day in a minute. Other thoughts on the end of the Old Covenant? Jim?
If you even go back to the Genesis reference we had earlier, God worked for 7 days and then rested. So remember the Sabbath. There is a deliverance aspect. God delivered his people. Okay, you don't have to work on the seventh. Then you get into, you were slaves in Egypt, but God delivered his people. So you're not in slavery anymore. Then for years and years and years, there was God promising to deliver his people when they were in captivity. So there's this constant, do this and remember that God has delivered you and will deliver you.
There's an overarching promise, though, right? That all of these other deliverances come under a larger promise of deliverance, right? And all of that Old Testament history is driving towards Christ, right?
And then you get into the New Testament, so you don't have to change. Why not the Sabbath? And we already mentioned, communion and remembering the first day of the week. This part is speculation for me. Those are also things that we do in remembrance of him delivering us from sin. Slavery, not slavery to Egypt, but slavery to sin.
Yeah, I don't think that's speculation.
But, no, not that part. It's the next line that's speculation.
Okay.
Because perhaps for human nature, we talked in the series on Hebrews about how, the new covenant is so much better than the old covenant. Maybe there had to be some change. If everything was repeated in the new covenant, then did anything change? But here, that's a marker. You remember the first day of the week. So that's a marker that something changed. For human nature, again, we're doing this stuff to remind ourselves. Maybe that's a memory point.
Okay, so Jim's saying that sometimes if you have a change in process, but everything looks exactly the same, you don't recognize that there was a change, right? Meet the new boss, same as the old boss, right? The idea that we have a different day of remembrance is to indicate a new system, right? All right, so I think y'all know we're going to Acts 20 and verse 7. It says, on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. So what we have here isn't a command, right? There isn't in the New Testament a specific command. You come together on the first day, you worship me on the first day, like there was a command of rest on the seventh day, right? So what we call this is an apostolic example, right? So we see Paul telling us, or we're being told that Paul is teaching. I guess technically it was Luke writing, right? We're being told that the church met on the first day of the week to break bread. So there's two things there that we follow as an example of what we're supposed to do, not necessarily an order to do it, right? So why? Why do we have that? And so we're going to kind of wade off into where Jim was going. If you look at Matthew 28, verse 1, it says, "Now, after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, 'Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen. As he said, come see the place where he lay.'" So we've already kind of touched on it, but Jesus was raised from the dead on the first day of the week, and that's why we come here. It's a remembrance of that resurrection, right? And I've kind of covered a little bit, but anybody have thoughts on the resurrection or how that relates to why God would want us to meet to worship on Sunday? Do we agree that he was, basically crucified on Friday and raised on Sunday? We're all in agreement on that? Oh, good. Because I don't really have any proof otherwise. Yes.
When you think about this and think about the things that have been said, comparing these two, it was important to the children of Israel to have this to remember that on the seventh day, they were resting, like had been mentioned, God rested on the seventh day after he had done all the work of creation. And this was very much tied in with the sacrifices for the people, for the priests, that all had to be done to roll the sins forward, because those sins could never be forgiven until Christ died. Now this was a totally different focus on the first day of the week. We're not remembering the rest period, but yet the sacrifice and the resurrection of Christ. And it's a complete different focus, and just like the new law is different from the old law, in that the old law could not do away with sins. Hebrews talks about this. The new law could. There needed to be a whole different focus.
Charles, let me ask you a question right there, though. Was the old law meant to do away with sin?
Was it what?
Was it constructed or built or meant to do away with sin?
No.
It wasn't designed to do away with sin, because we were never going to be able to meet the old law, which was kind of the point of having the old law, right? To prove to us that we weren't capable of meeting it, right? So Charles's point was that the old law kicked sin forward, and you had to have all these sacrifices and every sort of a kind of a pomp and circumstance around it, right? And now we're in a new system, so we have a new output or physical manifestation of how that's observed. Was that where you were? Okay.
Maybe just one of the things that happens too, a lot of times people still want to go back and draw parts of this old law under the new law.
Yes.
The dispensation, not realizing that this is something totally different and the focus is different.
Hang on to that, because I got a question about that. I got a lot of questions today, kind of why I shortened the material that we have here. But we're going to ask about that. So, right. Let's see. Let's look in Acts 26 and 7, right? So we've already read 7, but it says, "But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for seven days. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight." And of course, we remember that Eutychus fell out of the window and all of that. And it's a horrible example for preachers, and we can't have that. We got a clock, right? But essentially what we see there is that this was an intended thing. It wasn't just a happenstance, right? So, all right. So let's kind of take a summary of where we've been so far, and then we'll kind of move over into some discussion questions. It says, the law of Moses, right, set out a 7-day week, with the seventh day of that week being a day of rest, right? So we saw that in Deuteronomy and in Exodus. So far this morning, hopefully we've shown that the old law has been replaced by the new law, right? So that's Romans 8, 1 through 4, Romans 10, 4, and Galatians 3, 10 through 14. We looked at those verses, right? We've seen now here in Acts 20 that the New Testament church, specifically guided by the apostles, right? So not just random acts, met on the first day of the week. And when we look at what they did, if we want to be if we want to be the first century church, then we have to do what the first century church did, right? So we followed that example. All right, so everybody track that? Does that sound like fair logic? This is what they did in the Old Testament. The Old Testament has ended. This is what they did in the first century. We want to be the first century, so this is what we do here. Everybody agrees with that? Okay. All right. So, having said all of that, here's your first question. Is there anything wrong with worshiping on Saturday?
I said no.
You said no. All right.
That's exactly right.
Worship every day of the week. So we probably have an example of that in our own schedule of events, right? Every Wednesday we come together, we have Bible class, and we have a little worship afterwards, right? So that's right. There's no prohibition against having worship on any day of the week, right? But if we have worship on Saturday, we still need to have worship on Sunday, right? So you can't exclude Sunday, because we see the example from the New Testament. And what else can't be excluded? What else has to happen? Lord's Supper on Sunday, right? Not going to ask that question mark. I see the smirk, and I'm not going to talk about it. I told Tricia, we're not going to talk about that topic. So, all right. All right, so we've kind of already done this a little bit, but sort of a compare and contrast. Compare the Sabbath with the first day of the week worship. So how are they alike? How are they different? Charles?
Under the worshiping on the Sabbath, this required animal sacrifice, right?
I'm sorry, what was that?
This would require now on the first on the Sabbath, they weren't supposed to be in rest, but did they have to have sacrifices on the Sabbath, or was that on other days?
So that's a good question, right? The commandment is not a day of worship, right? The commandment is a day of rest. There were some sacrifices that were done on the Sabbath, right? But that's actually not part of the commandment here. And that's another topic that we'll talk about the commands in the Mosaical law, how they're the same and different, yeah? But carry on.
But under the new law, the command on the first day of the week is to partake of the Lord's Supper, which is going back to this is a totally different focus. That is something that a day of rest versus a day of
Yes. So Charles is saying that the Old Testament was rest. New Testament is remember. Mark?
There's a couple of things. On the Sabbath, they did not come together. This was the Sabbath as a day of rest. They were basically devoted to meditation. That was what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to essentially count their blessings. Think about what God had done for them, how God had delivered them from Egypt, how God had created the earth. But they were to meditate and rest. There were travel restrictions. They couldn't move more than a quarter of a mile.
They were confined to space, right?
So they could not come together as a congregation. The other thing was any sacrifices for worship, not associated with the Sabbath necessarily, were all conducted by the priest. We, on the other hand, come together to worship on the first day of the week, and we are the priest.
Absolutely. So I think everybody probably heard Mark, but just to repeat, the Sabbath was restrictive. It's almost internalizing it, right? Like remember, but keep to yourself. Whereas first day of the week, we're called to gather together, and whatever worship was happening on the Sabbath was being conducted for you, and what's happening, worship here, is being conducted by you. I like that, right?
I'd also like to add, too, in Romans chapter 10, when he talks about salvation for all, in verse 12, he says, "For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek." Now, that actually means there then that there must have been a distinction between Jew and Greek. And what delineated Jew from the Greek? They had Sabbath day. Now, because both Jew and Gentile are together, there must be a distinction that makes us different from what was prior to. And that distinction is we now have the first day of the week. So everyone can be involved.
So let me fine tune that a little bit, I think, right? If you look at the verse, it says that the Sabbath was for everybody, right? Including sojourners or foreigners within their midst, right? So oddly enough, I think the Sabbath was a part of the Mosaical law that was for everybody, right? It was to be observed by all. In fact, if you...
I would think for the Jews and those who were proselytized to Jews, so they had to be considered Jews. It wasn't for the Gentiles.
No, it says for everybody. So, yes, ma'am. We're going to talk about that, but you're right. So Keith, I was just going to say, it says, you shall not do any work, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your ox, your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who's within your gates. And if you remember Nehemiah, he threw them away from the walls. They were the people who weren't observing the Sabbath were camping against the walls and kind of enticing the people to go out and buy things, right? He threw them away from the walls. So I think the difference in the law of Moses comes in other areas, and that's where that distinction between Jew and Gentile lay. But anyway, Christy, yes. And so what you had was a mandatory day off, right? If we pull back and we say we're going to observe the Old Testament Sabbath, right? Y'all might lose your 2-day weekend because it was a 6-day work week, right? So there is, in fact, a command in that says you will work 6 days and you will be off on the 7th day. So God did expect them to be productive, to be engaged in work, right? The other thing that I had here was that the Sabbath was from God to man, right? He said, I gave them my Sabbath, right? And our worship is from us to God, right? So there's a little bit of a flip-flop in that day, in that regard. And touching on Joe, I said the Sabbath was a material thing. It was a don't do work, whereas our worship is a worship in spirit and truth, right? So it's not a physical manifestation. Obviously, we sing and we preach and whatnot, but yes.
I've always loved the kind of the imagery parallel that we see of, again, the Sabbath, again, to your point, was God to mankind, which is very akin to the old law, right? I mean, it was God's will and God's parameters that he gave to mankind. And there is that in the New Testament, but fast forward to coming together now, it is us up to God. It's a more relational view than there was in the old law. And so in a lot of ways, the Sabbath versus us getting to come together, I think really parallels God's standard at the time, right? Sabbath very much paralleled and fit in with the old law, the old way. And then you fast forward to now, us getting to come together, it doesn't have some of the restriction that the Sabbath and the old law had, and that's true of the new covenant, right? I mean, if it had all the restriction that the old law had, Christ didn't come and do what he did. He came to abolish a lot of the restrictiveness because he paid for all that. So there's now kind of a reverse focus of us up to God, and that's just a really beautiful thing.
So if this was a business relationship, right, I would say that the old law was more by command or by dictate, whereas the new covenant is more by agreement or incentive, right?
It's our privilege. We get the opportunity. It's not, I mean, we're asked to come together as a remembrance, but I think the bigger focus is it's not, I'm forcing you, come do this, which, the old law had a little bit of that hint.
Do this or else.
Right, right. This is more of, look what's happened, and that you should feel compelled because of the privilege to get to come as a response to what's already been done, as opposed to or else.
It's the pearl of great price, right?
Yeah.
You've found this wonderful thing, you want to have it, right?
Right.
Circumcision and uncircumcision. I mean, that was their commitment, in the Old Testament, and that was the first creation. And as it says in Galatians 6, circumcised, uncircumcised doesn't mean a thing. It's the new creation. So it's the new creation versus the first creation.
Right. So we had a pretty big change, right?
Jimmy, it's kind of been inferred all along, but I do think one other thing is the old covenant, and this is an ordinance within that covenant, was between God and an ethnic nation. Here, this is, in the New Testament, it's a covenant with all people who are in Christ. It's a spiritual, not a earthly.
It's not a hereditary thing, right? It's a choice that you can make, right? Yeah. All right, guys. So clock is slow. We're getting hands out there, but I will say this, or the last question I was going to ask you was, do Christians have a rest, right? Because we don't have a commandment of rest. And the answer to that is yes. In Hebrews 4, 1 through 2, and then skip 8 to 11, talks about the rest that remains for us. Anyway, have a look at that, and we will see you guys next week when we will be completely afield of any of the, it'll be a whole new day. Thank you all.